Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are getting ready to start our Newslit PD in a minute. Before we move off this screen, I just want to point out that we would love it if you would all follow us on social media at Newslit Project on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Medium, etc. So be sure to connect with us there. All right, well, welcome everybody. This is our final webinar of the series, October 27th, Understanding Bias. It is such a complex topic, and there is really a lot of components and things to discuss with regards to this. Shout out to Smart News for making this webinar series possible and free to everyone participating. We are going to move on. So everyone is muted in case you haven't noticed yet. So I want to point out the chat and the Q&A box. Make sure that you've toggled down so that you're chatting with all your colleagues here, not just the panelists. And be sure to put your questions in the Q&A section. That's the area where our ed team, we're joined tonight by John and Susanna and Hannah and I, where we're going to be pulling the questions from to answer during the session. But we do encourage chatting as well. And now I would love to introduce Peter Adams, our SVP of Education, to drop some knowledge. Go for it, Peter.
Thanks, Miriam. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here again for another hour for our webinar series here, tackling a really meaty topic, the subject of news media bias. This is easily the most requested topic that we hear from educators, from students. It's very much on the minds of the general public, and it's something that is enormously complex, and there's a lot of kind of misunderstandings about. And so we have tried to develop a way of approaching bias and teaching it to students that we think captures the complexity and also helps empower students to think critically about the news that they encounter. So let me just advance here. I want to start with some findings of a recent study. This American Views 2020 study was produced by the Knight Foundation and Gallup in July of this year. And just some quick key findings to kind of frame our discussion today. Broadly speaking, the report found that the media's watchdog role, or its ability to hold those in power to account, is compromised by what the public perceives as increasing bias in news coverage. This is something that I think you see and hear a lot online if you look at comments on news pieces, or you just talk about news coverage or journalism with folks. People sort of always feel like there's more bias now than in a previous era. People often harken back to Walter Cronkite, and they feel like that perception is absolute, that it's just beyond obvious. But when you really drill down on some of these questions, what counts as bias? What makes you feel like you're seeing more of it? Where do you see it? What form does it take? Some of those perceptions start to get a little more nuanced and refined. So it's part of what we're after in this session. Secondly, most people believe, or a lot of Americans believe, this report found that they've not only lost the confidence in the ideal of a so-called objective, or what might be more productively thought of as an impartial, fair and accurate news media, but they believe that news organizations actively, intentionally, or actively or tactically support the partisan divide. So that's an increasing perception as well, that all news organizations have some sort of partisan orientation. We've touched on that a little bit in one of John's sessions with the media bias maps and their limitations and how they're good as conversation starters. So we'll talk a little bit more about that today as well. Diving into some of these findings, just to highlight, more Americans are concerned about bias in the news that other people are getting. So this is really common. Most people think news media are biased, but they generally don't think that news media are biased in their favor, right? And they think that other people are consuming biased media. Some people, far fewer, 29%, are worried about their own news. 3/4 of Americans say they see too much bias in news that's supposed to be objective. So 75% of people think they see too much of it. But again, we really want to drill down today on what counts as bias and how we recognize it. One other finding, people largely perceive mistakes to be intentional. So when there are inaccuracies, when bias affects the accuracy of a report, they think this is intentional. And there's a big partisan difference between Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives on perceptions of bias in the news media. So those are all really important findings that can kind of inform your exploration of this with students. So some driving questions for us today. First, the big one is just what counts as news media bias and who decides? This is a big driving question that can kind of just sit at the center of everything that we talk about today. Secondly, what can journalists and news outlets or news organizations do to try to minimize bias or try to eliminate it from coverage? What steps can they take? What steps do they typically take? And then how can educators effectively teach this concept? Because it is so complex, it does tend to be highly subjective. It can be very controversial. So how can you effectively teach this to students? Just a quick definition from our word wall. Again, we have a living word wall in Checkology that is aligned to the lessons that are there. So this is pulled from there. But basically, when assumptions or opinions favoring one side or interpretation of an issue and event skew reporting in some way that's unfair or distorting, right? It's kind of the definition that we've come up with for news media bias. So that gets us started on that first question of what counts as news media bias. But of course, we need to drill down on that much further. Some supporting questions that we can then explore. What do people really mean? People are fond of saying that something is left of center or right of center. This leans left or leans right or skews left. But what does that really mean? What does it look like when coverage does that? And how much of that is our perception? And what counts as the center? So everybody likes to think that there is a hypothetical center, even on those media bias charts. But what counts as the center and who decides what belongs there? And then is most bias obvious and on purpose or overt and intentional? Or is it subjective? Is it a perception that we could debate? And is it incidental? Is it not on purpose? And a few questions that we can take up. Whether our own perceptions of bias are reliable. So our experience of news is itself subjective. Bias is about more than partisanship, but that's a good supporting question to explore with students. People often only talk about bias in partisan terms. And then finally, the journalistic ideal of objectivity has, always sparks a lot of conversation and controversy. So asking the question or pursuing the question, is it still a helpful or useful concept is a great question to keep at the center of a lot of your inquiry with students. So I want to start off before we explore some of these questions just with a quick poll. And I think, John, if you can bring that up, which of the following statements here most accurately reflects your perception of bias in news media? So first, most journalists and news outlets don't really think about it. They don't really consider it. Or do they intentionally bias stories and seek to get their audiences to believe specific things? Do you think most journalists and news outlets try to make their straight news reporting as impartial, as fair, and as accurate as possible, but they have blind spots? Or you haven't really thought about it? About 50 votes so far. Let's just give this another 20, 30 seconds, or you haven't really thought about this issue as the fourth option. Okay, great. So about 78% of you, so just shy of 80% of you answered the third, that journalists and news outlets, for the most part, try to make their straight news reporting impartial and fair and accurate, but they do have blind spots that cause them to fall short. This is a question that we actually ask our students in Checkology as they're coming into this lesson. So before they even start the lesson or before they even start the platform, we asked them this question. They have a sort of similar breakdown. A surprising number of students actually answer the third, which I think reflects kind of the most sort of nuanced approach to this topic, staying away from the cynical assumption that all journalists and news outlets have some ulterior motive. But this is sort of a springboard into exploration of the topic. So a follow-up question, and I'd love to tackle this in the chat. Let me go ahead and open my chat as well. A follow-up question here that I'd love to just get some chatted responses. If you believe people are at the mercy of their biases, or in other words, is there any point in us trying to acknowledge and set them aside? Or is that sort of a hopeless case? We're all biased, all of our work is going to be biased, and there's nothing we can do about it. What are your thoughts on that question? There are people, obviously everything humans do has some degree of subjectivity. Are we at the mercy of our biases? Can we overcome them? Can we minimize them? This is something obviously that teachers can think about as well. So awareness is important, Nicholas says, even if we can't completely overcome them. Not hopeless, Tiana says, awareness can make a difference. You can minimize. It's valuable to teach students about bias, Sue. Yes, we agree. All our work has subjectivity, but it's worth trying to look beyond it as much as possible. So it really feels like everyone's sort of on the same page. We should try to recognize them, and it does make a difference to recognize, right, and as Kate points out, if you can name your bias, you can recognize it and mitigate it, and awareness is very important. Often this is not work that we can do alone, right, because bias so often is comprised of blind spots, things we don't know, things we don't know that we're doing that are not impartial or not fair. It's helpful to have other folks working with you or other sets of eyes on things, on your practice of whatever it might be. A great way to kind of bring this home for educators is to think about biases against students, right? Do your biases prevent you from being fair with all of your students? Obviously, teachers have lots of different experiences with students, but do your biases affect your teaching, or do they cause you to treat students differently? I think that's a question that teachers can relate to that is similar to some of the issues that journalists face when they cover issues, especially issues that they care about in some way or have a personal stake in. So let's take a look just at some quick, there's no real way to do a comprehensive survey of actual pieces of news that are or are not biased. Again, it's not a binary and it's highly subjective. So what we're going to do today is just take a look at how bias kind of circulates online in conversations about coverage, how some outlets kind of grapple with it and show it in edits to a piece. And like, for example, this New York Times piece we're going to discuss here in a moment. And then we'll work through some hypothetical scenarios and think about a kind of framework for teaching bias. So how can we break this down into types and then forms of bias that we can help students use to identify it more readily and more accurately and in a more nuanced way. So this piece was published initially, as you can see in the upper left, June 2nd, following protests in Washington. And there was quite a bit of controversy about the role of the military and I believe the National Guard in Washington, countering protests outside the White House. This is when Trump made his famous walk to St. John's Church and took a picture there. And one tactic that was used was a kind of show of force tactic by helicopters. This is a military maneuver that's used to sort of disperse people in an area, and that was used in Washington, lowering military helicopters down to rooftop level to make a lot of noise and just sort of alarm people and get them to leave a given area. And so this was the initial headline and abstract on the New York Times coverage of that Washington protest and response by police and the military. There is a Twitter account that's an automated account that tracks changes to New York Times stories that tweets at the handle @NYT_diff. So it's named Editing the Gray Lady at NYT_diff, and it tracked the changes to this piece. And I used archives of the different iterations of this to grab the screenshots. So the first edit that was made to this after it was published on June 2nd, so right away, all the changes I'm going to look at happened June 2nd. It dropped a lot of the language out of the abstract. So if you just compare the first abstract here, these descriptions, signs are torn from buildings, protesters hid in doorways, to this, military helicopters sought to discourage protesters, and retired senior military leaders condemned their successors for deploring such tactics. So I wondered in the chat if anybody can just tell me what you notice. What's the difference here between this abstract at the top, talking about signs being torn from buildings, tree limbs snapping, protesters hiding in doorways, to this one? What do you think was the logic here behind that particular update to the story? Or what was the effect? Cynthia, the first one is much more descriptive. It removes emotion, Peggy said, from 1 to 2. Yeah, the first had more emotional language. The edited version is less sensational. Yep, visual imagery in the first one. How many people feel that the first one is more or less biased or more objective? Tiana feels the first is more biased. Other folks do not necessarily feel that way. So Peggy says emotion is not bias, right? If that's actually what was happening, although clearly some people responding to the story felt that this was unfair, and they got some pushback. And that's part of the reason, a large part of the reason they made this. Okay, both are objective, but the second is more clear, says Nicholas. So interesting. So we could debate this, right? Because again, these are very subjective conversations. We could show this to 10 people and probably get a range of opinions and positions on whether or not and how biased that might be. Compared with this, the next change they made is to drop American, both instances of American from the headline. So whereas the original headline read the American military's newest target, American protesters, they then dropped those, and the new headline just read the military's newest target, protesters, which is quite different, right? Which is quite different. The next edit then changes the headline again. Former commanders fault Trump's use of troops against protesters. So now they've changed the headline. And then another change to the abstract. So, and this is the version of the story that's live on the site today, just for the abstract and the headline. Obviously, to really get a sense of the coverage, we would have to look at not just this piece, but the New York Times coverage of the DC protests over time. So over those several days in the aftermath of this issue. But just for the purposes of this session, you know, these changes to headlines, changes to abstracts, the conversations about whether a headline or an abstract is fair, whether a lead image is fair or misleading, can be really productive for students to really help them home in on and reflect on, you know, that core question that we started with: what counts as bias and who decides? How much agreement is there, and how do news organizations sort of grapple with this? So yeah, and Cynthia says, you know, the removal of American makes it less biased, like it seemed like a dig, right? American military targeting American protesters. So you could imagine some of the blowback this got. If you find this coverage or find the New York Times initial tweets about this, you can see some of the pushback on Twitter. Earlier, just a few days before the Chicago Tribune, you know, there was unrest in Chicago following the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and the Chicago Tribune, after a night of unrest, ran this front page. I'm just going to use 2 Chicago front pages here again to highlight some of the considerations that news outlets have. One big challenge for news outlets in covering protests this summer was to reflect the fact that they were largely peaceful, but that violence still also happened, right? So how do you reflect that? How do you convey the fact that there was hours of peaceful protest that had pockets of violence or that ended in violence or unrest? And what language do you use to describe that? So the way that the Tribune chose to do that is to run with this picture, which is a shocking picture, and then to say that protests gave rise to chaos, right? And so we could debate the merits of the word chaos and whether that's as objective as it could be, or as impartial, or if that's fair, or if we could rewrite this headline. So let's take a look at what the Sun-Times did. So the Chicago Sun-Times, the other major daily paper in Chicago, ran with this, burning rage, and then beneath that noted that it turned violent, and then they used the word looting, which is another word that news outlets have to be very cautious and deliberate about using. And there's a lot of debates, not just in newsrooms, but obviously online, about the use or avoidance of that term. So, you know, part of what I'm trying to surface here is a tension between the newsworthy aspects of an event and the issue of representation. So both of these images capture, you know, the newsworthy element of that day. Obviously, a large-scale protest is itself newsworthy, but what was most pressing and urgently newsworthy from the night before, from the day before, were the pockets of violence, the burning of police cars. That was sort of elevated to the level of a very big, you know, story. So how do you convey what the protests largely looked like? How do you convey that the violence was limited, but still also capture these very shocking images without making people think that the whole day was like these images here? Right? It's a challenge for news outlets, and I think there is a real tension between the newsworthy elements of an event, which tend to be the most unusual or interesting elements, and then representation. And we can talk more about that later in Q&A. Tragically, just yesterday, a man was shot in West Philadelphia. So this story is again playing out. And I just kind of grabbed some reactions to this local ABC affiliate's Facebook posts today. Here's their initial Facebook post and headline. So there are some questions about how much vetting social media language goes through in news outlets. And then in the aftermath here, people saying, you know, probably more to it than what the media is showing. The media likes to leave out a lot. Some of the comments here, one person commenting, oh, you know, race isn't relevant here. Why didn't you mention the race of the victim? And then someone else saying, you know, for once they didn't put race, hooray, thinking that that doesn't belong there. And then someone else taking issue with the use of the word reportedly. Obviously, when news outlets can't confirm a detail, they have to use suspected, allegedly, reportedly, but people also tend to sometimes see bias in those terms. Back in May, a local channel in Nashville posted these two posts just an hour apart, and people perceived, rightly so, you know, a sharp contrast between the way these two stories were handled. And what I want to highlight is how the News 5 in Nashville handled it. So they, first of all, admitted that, you know, this was pretty blatantly unfair when you put these next to each other. They shared that these were posted by two different people, and then they reflected on their values and what they're going to do to avoid this kind of error in the future. So they owned it and explained exactly kind of how it happened and what steps they're taking in response. I think that is handled, you know, quite well by this outlet in that pretty blatant example there. So some key points, because I do want to get to this taxonomy, and then I'm going to introduce 10 key points total in this session. I'm going to start with 5. Then we're going to take a look at that sort of taxonomy for teaching news media bias, and then look at another 5. But 5 key points here up top is that, number 1, conversations about news media bias mostly apply to straight news. So this is a point that John made in his first session. When there is no aspiration to be fair and accurate and impartial, or to be objective, news media bias isn't really a part of the conversation. It's only when you're looking at a straight news report that comes into play. So opinion journalism, things like columns and editorials or punditry, is really supposed to express a point of view. There's no aspiration not to express bias. So that's one check. And just a reminder that the work of the opinion department at a news outlet is sort of separate from the straight news or editorial side. There's a kind of firewall between those two departments. And the editorial side is supposed to be entirely independent of the opinion desk and also the ownership of the newspaper to avoid any biasing of content. But people react to opinion pieces all the time. So here's an example of that: Donald Trump Jr. reacting to an opinion column, but saying that the New York Times is calling for Twitter to do this. This is really Kara Swisher, a columnist for the New York Times in this case. Second, I touched on this at the beginning, but our perceptions of news and our perceptions of bias are themselves highly subjective. So we all perceive and interpret news coverage differently based on our experiences and beliefs, our values, our politics, our worldviews. And I made this point earlier, while no one really thinks the media is biased, while everyone tends to think the media is quite biased and that it's obvious, people tend not to think that it's biased in their favor. You can see this play out online every day when people allege bias of a piece of news in opposing ways. So liberals see conservative bias and conservatives see liberal bias in the same headline, the same lead photo, the same story selection. So those are really rich moments, though. So again, I think to just underscore that point, that the perception of news media bias is the beginning of inquiry, not the end. And we really have to interrogate our perceptions because, again, we really are viewing all of these things through our own life experiences, including as consumers of news, right? This is a short clip of a motion graphic in Checkology that I think draws that into focus really well. And there's a recent podcast by Michael Lewis called Against the Rules that I think the first episode in particular, called Ref You Suck, just focuses on how everyone hates the refs in sports. Diehard fans think that the refs mess up every game against their team. No one really thinks the refs are biased in their favor. The same kind of goes for journalists. It's an easy parallel to make and can be a good starting point with students. Third, news media bias really is usually, the overwhelming majority of the time, incidental, so accidental, not on purpose, and highly debatable. So it's perceived. It's something that we could debate and come up with a lot of different perceptions about. And that's really important just when helping students grapple with exactly what news media bias is and how to approach it. We like to compare biases to blind spots, right? And the standards, the processes of verification, usage standards for language, and also newsroom diversity are really there to help eliminate those blind spots, right? To eliminate the subjectivity in the process. So really verification and quality journalism is more helpful to think about that as a process. And then when it comes to newsroom diversity, again, closing blind spots that could lead to, say, demographic bias, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So you can see here the reflection of a standards-based outlet sort of being accountable, which is a big value in journalism for their coverage. And that's really important to look for. And then, of course, there is a style that guides the use of particular terms like looting, or when you can or can't or should or shouldn't mention race, for example, at most news outlets. And again, that's intended to standardize coverage and to make it as impartial and fair and accurate as possible. And again, the American Society of News Editors does do a newsroom diversity survey if you're interested in the level of diversity at your local outlets. Fourth, we've hinted at this, but bias really isn't a yes/no binary. Something either isn't biased or unbiased. It's sort of more or less, right? Because you can always approach objectivity but never really achieve it. But that doesn't mean that everything that isn't objective is equally biased. And that's a trap that I think students fall into a lot. And then finally, evaluating this stuff, if that's not obvious by now, takes a lot of nuance and specificity, right? So biased how? Biased in what way? How could it be better? How could it be more impartial? How could it be fairer, right? So I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and you can see here the nuance and specificity that was involved in all the changing edits to this piece, which caused so much controversy when it was first published. So those are some first 5 key points. I want to pause here for some quick questions. Miriam, I'm sure we have a lot. I see the chat kind of going here, and I'm going to bring on 2 of my colleagues who are former journalists themselves. Susana Gonzalez, who spent a lot of her career at the Austin American-Statesman and at Reuters, and Hannah Covington, who was a reporter at the Minneapolis Star-Tribune for most of her career in journalism, just to join me for this initial Q&A. And then we'll go through the taxonomy quickly and bring them back at the end. So Miriam, do we have time maybe just for three or 4 questions here to answer questions about that initial piece?
Yeah, so Peggy is asking, does fair and unbiased imply providing both sides and balanced reporting?
That's a great question. I'll take a stab, and then if I miss something, Susanna or Hannah, if you're on, it would be great to have your take. Generally, that can be a real pitfall for journalists when there are 2 relevant sides of a story. Obviously, mentioning or including both perspectives is important. If there were, say, an auto accident between 2 people, you would need to get 2 people's version of events and not leave one person out, to be fair. But in a debate like climate change, if you try to include both sides, it can really distort the issue or bias the issue in a way that is inaccurate. So that's something called false balance, or a lot of people call that both sides journalism. So there are real pitfalls in false balance. Hannah, Susanna, you have any additional thoughts there?
Yeah, absolutely. This is Hannah. I know when I was writing a story or covering a topic over time, something to keep in mind is that often in a single story, we try to be as balanced as we can and include as many relevant perspectives as we can. But sometimes balance also happens over time for a particular subject. So say there's a big development happening in a community, and one story focuses more on the neighborhood reaction where that development's going in. But the story the previous week focused on the developer's perspective, right? So in this case, balance happened kind of over the course of that coverage and not in a single story. So that's an important point to keep in mind.
I think that goes back, Hannah, to my point about consumption of news being subjective and imperfect, right? So people hear a piece of a news report when they jump in their car and turn on the radio. They see one piece of coverage, but not the overall package of coverage, right? So, and that's a challenge for consumers. It's also a challenge for news outlets, right? News outlets have to remember that not everybody's reading every single story on that issue. So they have to think about how to remind people about previous coverage. And, I think folks consuming the news in the public have to not rush to judgment based on a single story as well.
That's right. I was just going to add, you see this a lot in local election coverage, for example, where a news organization will, profile a candidate one day, another candidate the next day, another candidate the next day. So while the one single profile of one candidate may seem, to favor that person, over time, as Hannah mentioned, the news organization is trying to be broad in their coverage and minimize bias in that way over time.
Great. That's a great question. Miriam, do we have another one?
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple that are kind of tag teaming here. Mary Carroll is asking, how do viewers know if they're watching a standards-based outlet? And Cynthia is saying, because so much media that looks like news, especially on TV, is opinion or discussion, is there a good way to know if something is straight news?
It's a great question.
This
is Susanna. I would really encourage looking at the banners under the labeling under the speaker and just paying close attention to those people and seeing whether or not they are commentators and go from there. And similarly in print outlets, also look for labels such as opinion, commentary, viewpoint, perspective that indicate that it's an opinion piece rather than a straight news piece.
Yep, and I think if it's broadcast, it can be dicey, especially if you're online. So, you know, lots of people are producing lots of video mocked up to look like news. So you have to be careful about your source. So a good quick web search for the name of the source to make sure that it's an actual legitimate, say, affiliate of ABC or NBC in a given city. They definitely have standards, right? If they're an affiliate of a national news outlet, if it is, you know, the local paper, they also have standards. But you can also look at the homepage and look at the other stories and get a sense of the coverage as well. But that's really important. All right, let's maybe move on so we make sure we get this taxonomy in, and then we'll leave as much time as possible at the end for Q&A. Hannah, Susanna, thank you so much, and we'll have them back to help me answer all of these great and not easy to answer questions. So I mentioned earlier that, you know, we've wrestled with the question of how to effectively teach news media bias for a long time. What we finally settled on, and you know, we launched a lesson last year on Checkology that guides students through this, is to give students a kind of mental framework to think about bias. And we broke that into types. So what drives some of these blind spots? What different types of bias are there? And then what forms do they take? So let's, I'm going to talk first about the 5 types that we've developed. This is not to say that these are the only types of bias. These are just the 5 major types that we thought, you know, would be helpful to focus on with students. Number 1, obviously, partisan bias. If coverage is biased in favor of or against a political candidate or party, or even an issue in a partisan way. Demographic bias, so when blind spots of gender or race or ethnicity or other demographic elements characteristics of influence coverage. This is, again, part of the reason that newsroom diversity is so important. Newsrooms have struggled for years with achieving newsroom diversity. It's an ongoing struggle for most news outlets. Corporate bias is another potential bias. So if the ownership of a paper were to influence coverage, or the business interests generally were to influence coverage, we think that would be count as corporate bias, right? It's sort of a helpful way to think about that. And then neutrality bias. This is something we came up with to describe that issue of false balance, the ideal of being neutral rather than being objective. So vaccines is a good issue to home in on here. News coverage shouldn't be neutral on the question of whether vaccines are effective. They are. We have very strong evidence to show that. So if the desire to be impartial morphs into a desire to be neutral, that can result in false balance. And then big story bias. So moving too fast on something that seems like a big story, that seems like a big scoop, and not verifying everything as carefully as you otherwise might. That is a potential bias for stories. And the way we introduce these in the lesson is just with hypothetical scenarios, again, because it's very hard to say something definitively is or isn't partisan bias. We came up with a series of hypotheticals. So I thought we could just answer these together here, and you could just tell me which type of the 5 biases I just described does this scenario describe. So in a year of covering advances in cancer research, a health reporter quotes dozens of doctors and other experts, but only 2 of those sources are women. What kind of bias, what type of bias would that be an example of? So Kelly, Kate, Mary, Tiana, yeah, all say demographic, right? So that would be one example of what demographic bias could look like. 2, the producer of a morning news show inadvertently dedicates more time to her preferred presidential candidate's platform than to the platforms of other candidates who are polling equally well in a primary, and you're all saying partisan bias, so you've got it. 3rd, if senior editors at a local news outlet decided that allegations of corruption by their publication's parent company are not newsworthy enough to be covered, but everyone else is covering that story, that would be an example of, you've got it, corporate bias. And then finally, if the social media manager at a national newspaper posted a story about a UN climate change report, and out of a fear that that reporting might seem biased, they added the caption, "Is climate change man-made?" ? Click here to find out. That would be an example of neutrality bias. Sorry, one more. This one is finally. A journalist who spends most of his time in a metropolitan area travels to a nearby rural community, and in his report, he describes the community as, quote, "a simple God-fearing slice of America." Yep, demographic bias as well. So we gave you more than 5 there, just to make it not as obvious by process of elimination. I'm gonna just recap here the types, or just pause here for a quick question just about the types, and we'll tackle other questions about bias generally at the end. Miriam, is there a specific question here about the 5 types that we introduced?
Not yet, Peter. I'm not sure if people are still rushedly typing it in, or but nothing yet.
Great. Well, let's power through and look at the forms that those 5 biases or types of bias can take. And these are more sort of, how do we recognize demographic bias when we see it? What are the different forms it could take? How, might partisan bias manifest itself in coverage? And one way is in the tone of coverage. So language choices and things like that. We talked a little bit about that with the New York Times example. Some of you highlighted some of the effect of the language there, or the word chaos in Tribune's coverage. So those would be issues of tone. Similar to tone, issues of framing, sort of the way an issue is summarized or approached, can give coverage a very different feel, right? And focus on different elements of a very complex issue, what the lead is, how the headline is written, what the lead photo focuses on, all are part of framing. The absence of fairness and balance. So this would be lopsided sourcing in a story, only talking to one side, giving someone more airtime. That would be not being fair or appropriately balanced in a story. Story selection is another way. So the news judgment of the piece itself. So what is counted as newsworthy is another potential form that a bias could take. So you can imagine a big story bias would result in very sensational news judgment. Demographic bias might underplay issues that affect specific communities in a city. And that's how story selection could be a form. And then finally, the actual sourcing in a piece. You could be lopsided in that example that we just talked about of citing 10 men as doctors or medical experts and only 2 women when other experts were available, would be an example of that. So let's go through the same process here and just more hypotheticals to try to drill down on what these forms might look like. And again, once we have that framework, then we could sort of turn ourselves loose on actual coverage and try to see if we could identify or make a case for these types and forms in action. So form number 1, if a producer of a morning news show inadvertently dedicates more airtime, this is the same hypothetical. What form is that? Right, the absence of fairness and balance. The rural representation hypothetical, in which a big city reporter describes a rural community as a simple God-fearing slice of America, yes, is an issue of tone. Senior editors at a news outlet decide to publish and kind of bury a story of controversial about their parent company. This is a little bit tougher. Story selection. This one's a little bit less about what to cover and more about what to feature. So what counts as a lead story or a big story. The social media manager at a national paper, afraid of being perceived as biased, writes that post, "Is climate change man-made?" Yeah, I would say framing also, right? So the how the story is framed is an open question in this case, and that's really misleading and kind of biases the story. And then this issue, after covering advances in cancer, I kind of gave the answer away to this one. If the sourcing is lopsided here, that's obviously taking the form of sourcing, as Sue here has just pointed out. I want to talk more about your impressions of that framework, 5 types, 5 forms, and how helpful you think that might be. But I want to touch on 5 more key points here, and then we'll wrap up with a lot of Q&A. And I'm kind of rushing to get to Q&A because there's always a lot of rich discussion, and I want to make sure we get Hannah and Susanna back here. So in general, using the word objective when we're talking about bias or an absence of bias can really be counterproductive. It tends to derail productive conversations about bias into whether or not it's ever possible to be objective or how that term is used or misused. So we tend to favor the terms fair and accurate as a way of describing sort of what the journalistic ideal of objectivity is about, or the spirit of it. Being unbiased, again, does not mean being neutral. So, you know, quality news coverage, unbiased coverage about the safety of vaccines or climate change should not be neutral on those questions, because the science, the facts aren't themselves neutral. Teach students to test their perceptions of bias and then fix the problems they find. So again, a perception of bias is just the beginning of inquiry. A great next step is to say, biased in what way? And then how could it have been more impartial, or how could it be fairer and more accurate? And be wary of cynicism or sweeping statements about the media. You see online a lot, the media wants you to think this, so the media is refusing to cover that. And often there's quite a bit of coverage about the stories that people say the media is refusing to cover. It's just that they feel strongly about that issue and their own biases are getting mixed up. So try to steer students away from cynical, sweeping statements about bias and into very specific, nuanced conversations about it. It's not just better for them and help guide them to better sources and better journalism, but it also helps them respond to news outlets in a more meaningful way that's likely to have an impact on coverage. And then finally, that point about the perception of bias being the beginning and not the end. So these 10 points, you know, we think coupled with that framework or that taxonomy, can really help educators grapple with this really complex topic and steer it in more productive directions. So I'm leaving here 11 minutes at the end. I do want to show just a quick snippet of, or just remind you rather, that we have this, the lesson Understanding Bias on Checkology, which is no cost to you. If you like the examples you saw, or you like this framework and are looking for a great resource to introduce it to students, you should definitely check this out. This is hosted by Indira Lakshmanan, who's now at National Geographic, but she has a long career in journalism. I'm kind of guiding students through this topic in 2 parts. So definitely check it out. My colleague Jordan just shared the lesson link in the chat. So Q&A, Miriam, I know we've probably been racking up a lot of Q&A, and I'd love to bring Hannah and Susanna back on and have their expertise here on the call and get some new questions out.
Great. Thank you, Peter. The questions are still coming in, and a few of them have been answered. We have one here. Framing is sometimes, this is from Megan, framing is sometimes a useful tool for focusing in on essentials or helping a reporter develop an angle. My students often struggle to see when a frame goes beyond a tool for understanding and instead presents bias. What could they look for to help them analyze this form of bias?
Sure. I'm going to let Susanna or Hannah take that one if they don't mind.
Sure. This is Susanna speaking. It might be useful to see how various outlets, or even comparing one news organization to another news organization's coverage of the same topic, such as let's say gun control. One news organization might cover it just straight with a straight news lead, whereas Another news organization might take an anecdotal approach and talk about how, and really feature, highlights a personal experience a resident had that had to do with gun control, and get into a story that way. So that's one way students might explore different framings of the same topic.
Great. Yeah, I think exploring, across coverage and doing comparisons of coverage is key. Really important to remember to compare coverage from the same news cycle or from this, as close as possible to the same time and date that they were published, because obviously coverage on different days is going to reflect different things. Great. Miriam, another question from folks here. And I'd love to know feedback about your perception of the framework of the 5 types, 5 forms, and how you think, whether you think that might help you sort of engage this topic productively with students as well.
All right, questions are rolling in, Peter.
Great. We
have one from Deb. She is wondering about the crossover between news media bias and rhetoric.
Maybe Deb can elaborate just a little more. I'm reading Deb's comments here.
Oh, okay. I was just going to say that at the start of the inquiry, I advise that students connect with background knowledge, which includes what do I think I know and feel about the issue, and what's contributed to my knowledge and feelings.
That's good. I think that's a really good first step to remind students that they are bringing a lot of themselves to the table when they're evaluating coverage. When you first said bias and rhetoric, I'm not sure if this is what you meant, but it is, allegations of bias are popularly weaponized, right? It is a favorite trope of pundits and a favorite tactic to say the media is totally biased. Just listen to me. I'll give you the straight truth. Politicians obviously weaponize allegations of bias. Bernie Sanders is really good at it. Donald Trump's very good at it, of dismissing coverage and saying the media is against me. Come straight to me, listen to my campaign. So it can become this sort of tactical, rhetorical device. And I think that's become more common. And I think that's at least partially responsible for the increase in the public's perception of bias, because punditry is also on the rise. Cable television and social media and everybody sort of leaning into their preferred opinionators, and many of whom talk about media bias or allege media bias, can cause people to perceive it more often.
Peter, if I can just interrupt for a second.
Yep.
So one of the things that Deb is getting to when we're talking about rhetoric, so one of the challenges when we're talking about news media bias and rhetoric is that rhetoric is one of the fundamental tools of argumentation, right? And so if you're talking about argumentation and that sort of thing, it's a completely different field, because if we're going to be evaluating news media bias, we're going to be looking at straight news. The taxonomy and the types and forms we have are designed to be applied to straight news and the shortcomings of coverage that way. Rhetoric, when we're talking about argumentative devices and things, and even getting into logical fallacies in those, right? In a sense, like that's just like any type of opinion piece, like that they're supposed to be biased in some way. So in a lot of ways, we can't really compare them because they're two completely different fields.
Yeah, I would say, yeah. So if students are perceiving an argument in a straight news piece, that might be a good entry point to some of those questions about where you're perceiving that, because that would be, an indication of bias, but then you'd want to home in on that and drill down. And then obviously exploring the strength of arguments in opinion journalism is another topic, but also a worthy topic to pursue with students. Miriam, we got time for a few more questions here while we have everybody.
Great, we have a few more questions. All right, this one from Barbara. Our local news stations often use on-the-street interviews about an issue and then generalize those individual opinions as public opinion. What kind of bias is this?
Well, I mean, in our framework, I think that would be, it depends. If they are selecting for, sensational opinions, that would be sort of big story bias, or if they're looking for the most sensational commentators, and then, that might be big story bias taking the form of sourcing, for example. But that's just, in our framework. Obviously, there's a lot of selection bias there that I think people need to be cautious about extending man on the street interviews to public opinion. And remember, it's quite different than a poll. Susanna, Hannah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on the practice of those interviews, especially in broadcast.
That's a tough one to answer. This is Susanna again. I agree with you, Peter, that it depends. You could look at a piece that features various person on the street interviews and look at the demographic spread of those people featured. You know, are they of different ethnic backgrounds, of different ages, of different professions, of different, different genders? That's one way you can look at that and see how bias might come into play.
Yeah, so is the sourcing there representative of the community, or?
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes.
Right.
All right, good.
Mm-hmm.
We have one from Kate. While the media might correct or change the story to correct biases in the original, since the original gets promulgated and the correction / edited version gets less play, does that indicate that the media might be counting on the greater impact of the original over future corrections?
I'll let Susanna and Hannah speak to this, but I don't think so. I think that suggests that news outlets kind of tactically try to get something out there that's agenda driven and then work behind and correct it. I think at most legitimate news outlets, standards-based outlets, errors are taken extremely seriously. They can end careers if there are too many of them, and having to edit headlines after the fact, or having to worse make a correction, is something that is taken very seriously. But I'd love Hannah and Susanna to sort of draw that into focus a little bit.
Definitely, it's taken very seriously. This is Susanna again. I can tell you that from my experience reporting, there is no worse feeling than having a correction. And as I've started working with the News Literacy Project, I've seen it as, I've come to appreciate corrections as signs of transparency and as a way to show commitment to telling the truth. And setting the record straight. So that's how I would encourage you to see corrections as good signs, as signs that what you are viewing is responsible standards-based journalism.
Right, certainly a total absence of corrections, or a source that never corrects errors or doesn't try to home in on the right language, would be another kind of red flag. I mean, corrections aren't desirable, obviously, and mistakes aren't desirable, but when they happen, correcting them is a sign of credibility.
And I just have one thought, if I could chime in. So Kate's questions that, does that indicate that the media might be counting on the greater impact of the original over future corrections? That was part of her question. I think it goes back to what Peter's saying. There's no secret plan at any of the news organizations I've worked with to try to hide corrections. There's an ongoing and very serious conversation about how to display corrections prominently on online stories. Some news organizations list them at the very top, but they're always included with the original report as much as possible so that people can see that displayed prominently.
Right, and again, the edits that happened, like we walked through those edits to the New York Times headline and abstract on the DC protest story from June, those really weren't corrections. I think there might be an editor's note on the story saying that some edits have been made, but sometimes not. Those kind of tweaks to headlines and abstracts really happen more now that we're in a digital news world, and those aren't always noted, which is one reason that Twitter bot that tracks those changes is so valuable.
All right, great questions, great answers. So Peter, this hasn't come up as a question, but it comes up at every webinar and in the chat also. Can we talk a little bit about the charts, the bias charts? There might be folks that didn't catch the prior session. So that might be helpful.
Sure.
Slides, et cetera.
Yeah, so, I think John addressed those a little bit in the first session and made the comment that they can be a helpful starting place. Many of the charts don't really make a distinction between the opinion desk and the straight news side, which again is really firewalled. So even though the New York Times opinion department has more progressive or liberal opinionators, that shouldn't influence their straight news coverage. So making that distinction is really important. And then characterizing again one or another news outlet or their coverage as consistently partisan is a highly subjective thing. So I have friends who think that, for example, the New York Times, since we're talking about the New York Times, is hopelessly liberal, and I think others who think that it's terribly conservative and problematic, and it actually hurts the things they care about if they're on the left. But when I drill down with each of those camps, they really can't explain substantively what about the coverage makes them feel that way. It's just kind of the reputation that they're used to attacking. So I think those charts kind of make the same sort of broad brush assumptions, and that we're better off really evaluating actual coverage over time. There are exceptions, obviously. There are openly partisan, largely commentary sites like Daily Chaos and Breitbart and Democracy Now! And things like that that make no aspiration to be impartial. But among mainstream outlets, I think it's really valuable to again compare coverage across a story. This is another thing that John did briefly in that first session. Look at, say, headlines from 3 different outlets, but remove the branding and just show them to students and say, which of these 3 do you think is the best, is the least biased, and then restore the branding and see if that surprises them. Or if Fox is supposed to be so much more the straight news side, not their opinionators, if Fox News is supposed to be so much more conservative than, say, CNN, take a CNN story and a Fox story about the same topic from the same news cycle, and again strip it away and see what differences students notice, and then reveal where they're from. That can be a really productive way to engage that, and I think much more nuanced way to do that than just giving them a chart.
Great. All right. We have a question from Cynthia. What do you say to someone, an adult I know, who believes that all news media is biased because each one, regardless of the side it's on, chooses what they want to highlight or write about and chooses to leave other news out? It's hard to argue because it's true that an outlet can't cover everything and will be leaving stories out.
Yeah, so this is, a lot to do with news judgment, and I'd love to get Hannah and Susanna's take. I mean, I'll say just briefly, we have a lesson on Checkology that helps kind of get to that, what drives news judgment, what the factors are, and then forces people in the position of making choices. And choosing what to cover and choosing a lead is a necessarily subjective determination made by a group of people. And you have to make something your lead story. You don't have a choice, and no matter which lead story you pick, some people are going to think it's biased. So I think putting that person in the shoes of making the choice, and then helping remind them no matter what they do, some people are going to think there's bias evident. If they're motivated to read bias into coverage, would be a good way to approach that. But Hannah, Susanna, I don't know if you have any experiences or comments or anything to add there about this.
Hi, it's Susanna. Just to add to what you've said, Peter, it is a matter of news judgment, and we journalists cannot fit everything. Not only make everything a story, but fit every piece of information they gather into one story. Mm-hmm. It's just journalists are working under time constraints, under space constraints, word limits. And you just can't fit it all. So a team of journalists, not just one person, but a team of journalists are trying to make those decisions on what to include and what to leave out in a way that is as fair and accurate as possible.
And again, I think, go ahead, Hannah. Go.
No, I was just going to say, especially in local newsrooms, one of the remember is that we take very seriously feedback that we get from readers if they feel like something wasn't included that is important to note. And these are serious conversations that journalists have who are writing the story, that editors have who are editing the story, and we try to get it right and try to include the most relevant and important information for the readers that we're writing for.
And I was just going to suggest again that coverage comparisons and highlighting which details are included or not. If you're comparing national coverage, taking 3 or 4 sources and even using, different annotation styles, different highlighters to highlight a detail that's in some of them and not others. And if there's one that's consistently an outlier in leaving something out, then that would be a red flag. If there's one local outlet that makes significantly different news judgments than everybody else, that could be a red flag, but you'd have to discuss it. But again, coverage comparison could help you there too.
Great. Do you want to start sharing some of the resources and then we can go back to a
Sure.
Q&A or?
Sure.
All right.
Miriam, do you want to talk about this? Do you want me to talk about this?
Sure. Presentations and resources. So we are going to be sharing these, the recordings. We're going to share the Q&As. This resource folder already has some of the materials in from the prior series, so feel free to drop in and poke around.
There's also a survey here that we'd love for you to take about this session, and if you haven't done it for the others. Just a reminder of our 5 of 5 of our resources here that we're highlighting. I think these are, no, they're not hyperlinked, but they're all in the resource folder in any case. Our Checkology Virtual Classroom, which we've mentioned, the SIFT, our weekly email newsletter for educators, that Hannah, Susanna, and I work on each week. Our News Lit Camp program, which I'll let Miriam talk about in a minute and just sort of pitch the one coming up. And then our resource library on our website and our educator network, which we're building. So go ahead and sign up with us and stay in touch, please. This is where you can find Checkology. This is where you can find information about the SIFT. And again, you'll get more of these slides or a copy of these slides in follow-up, so you don't have to try to keep up here. We also have a new podcast called Is That a Fact, which you can find in all of your favorite podcast places, and a mobile app called Informable here. And then Miriam, do you want to tell folks who don't know what a News Lit Camp is and about this great opportunity on December 10?
Sure thing. So News Lit Camp is usually a day long when it's in person, professional development experience for educators where we go into a newsroom and the information you would be learning would be in partnership with the journalists in the newsroom. We're doing this virtually now because, well, 2020, and just had one in Miami, and this will be our next one. It is open to educators across the country. It is in partnership with the Texas Tribune, and you can go ahead and sign up. The registration is open. It is going to be a really fun day. And we're going to have a morning session and an afternoon session. We can provide a certificate of participation if anybody needs that for professional development credit. And you will likely leave with lots of really great information. We're also working on another one for those in the San Francisco Bay Area. And if you're interested, you can also follow this link, NLC Interest. All bit.ly links are case sensitive, by the way. Just keep that in mind. We have done many over the past several years and are looking forward to keep them going.
Great. Yes, here's the link to that feedback survey as well. I think that's also in the resource folder. We really would appreciate your feedback. Just help us understand what was helpful to you, maybe what was not as helpful, how these could be better in the future, these sessions, what topics you might like us to address in a series or in a one-off in an upcoming webinar. So, I'm happy to hang out and answer questions. I know we've gone over time already, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but thank you so much for joining. If you joined us for all four, thank you so much for spending 4 hours with us here in the month of October. And if you haven't, please go back and check out those earlier sessions. And again, if anybody has any closing questions, I've seen some good ones come through. We will send you some text answers to those. But I'm also happy, and I think Susanna and Hannah have a few minutes if there is another big question as well. But I recognize folks probably have to jump.
Sure thing. Yeah, the Q&A is always so good.
I know.
We have a question from, it's our favorite part, the town hall. Here we go. We have a question from Rebecca. How do reporters ensure they aren't letting their own biases influence their reporting and writing?
I'm going to let Susanna or Hannah tackle that one, since they have many years as reporters.
It's a great question. Thanks, Rebecca. You know, we all journalists, just like everyone else, come to the job with their own blind spots. And, you know, when we're working on a story, minimizing bias is a collective effort. The reporter is not working alone. They're working with, they may be working with another reporter or more than one other reporter. But at minimum, you know, my stories were edited by 2 other people who, of course, come to the story with their own blind spots. But we're all working together to minimize bias in each piece of coverage.
Yeah, and the only thing I will add is that, you know, standards-based news organizations, reputable news organizations, we're held accountable if we miss the mark, because we do all have personal biases, and sometimes that slips into our coverage. And when that does happen, we are held accountable by our readers, by our fellow reporters, by our editors, and we do our very best moving forward to acknowledge that bias and keep it in mind, even as we're making sure our methods of reporting are verifiable and accurate and factual and as objective and kind of neutral as we can.
Yep. And I think some reporters, and you know, Hannah and Susanna, I know we've talked about this as a team, reflect on their own coverage, or news outlets or specific, you know, desks in a newsroom reflect on their coverage over time. An individual reporter might keep track of every source or review every source they've cited in a story, or every expert, to see if there's unintended sort of lopsided demographic bias evident in the sourcing, for example. So I think, you know, following reporters on Twitter and engaging with them, and you know, reporters tweet pretty openly about the process of reporting and their thoughts on the state of journalism, and that can be a great way to draw that into focus as well. Miriam, do we have any other questions, or should we wrap this up?
We have one more. Deb is asking, how do I answer, quote, how should I get the news?
That's a great question. I think we touched on this in a previous session just briefly, but the need to help students come up with a healthy media diet. We're actually, you know, working on a resource here coming up in the next couple months, trying to draw that into focus with a classroom activity in our resource library, but helping students think about the mix of information. I think too many folks passively consume news, so they just let their news diet be determined by whatever is pushed into their feed by algorithms and friends and people they follow online, and let the news find them. But being deliberate about consuming news and staying informed is a really important practice, I think more important than ever before, because it's so easy not to do that. And to pick a variety of sources, you know, pick a few national outlets that you intentionally turn to, go to their website, subscribe to the paper and actually look at it, you know, pick some broadcast newscasts to look at every night if you can, several times a week. And just be deliberate about your national and local coverage. Susanna or Hannah, I don't know if you have any other tips.
Just encourage to seek out news organizations who that publicly post their standards and guidelines that each of their journalists follow. In each of the newsrooms that I worked in, you know, on by day one, I was given a set of ethical guidelines and standards that I was to follow. I was expected to follow in all of my work with the news organization as a representative of the news organization. And, you know, news organizations have different distinct guidelines that they follow, and they make them publicly available. If there is an organization that does not make these publicly available, that's a red flag.
Yep. Or doesn't, you know, show evidence that they're being accountable, right? So they make an error and then
Yes.
just delete the story, or just change the headline and don't own it or acknowledge it. That can be a red flag.
Yes.
Great. Well, we will get to your answer to the rest of your questions. We'll comb through this chat and pull those out and send that in follow-up as well to this session. Thank you so much, Susanna. Thank you so much, Hannah, for joining me and helping me sort of flesh this out. Tackling this topic alone is too much for one person, and you both have such great experiences and expertise. So thanks to both of you. Thanks to everyone who joined tonight. I'm glad you found it helpful. And again, you know, please stay in touch for future opportunities, and consider joining us for the Texas Tribune Newslit Camp, because it's going to be really, really cool. So thank you so much. Have a great night. Enjoy the rest of your week, and be well.
Take care, everyone.